Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are continuing our series where we discuss various diets that contribute to a healthier life and a weight loss journey. And I'm joined today by Kristin, who is our nurse practitioner. And it's a follow-up to our series where last week we talked about the plant-based diet and how that contributes to a weight loss journey or a healthier lifestyle. Today we're focused on the Blue Zone diet, which has some similarities and some differences. And maybe, Kristin, you could say hello and tell us what the Blue Zones are.
Hello, and thanks for having me again. So in our last podcast, we talked about the Forks Over Knives documentary, which was a retrospective study looking at certain areas that had low incidence of certain diseases like cancers and diabetes. And the Blue Zone diet was found similarly. They looked at certain regions of the world that the communities lived to be into their 90s and 100s. And these blue zones, as they've been called, were identified by researcher Dan Buettner. And they include areas in Japan, Italy, Costa Rica, Greece, and Loma Linda, California. The diet emphasizes plant-based foods, whole grains, legumes, and moderate amounts of healthy fats, with limited animal protein, processed foods, and added sugars. So some of the key principles are plant slant or plant forward. So it is about 95% plant-based. So that is where we see a lot of the similarities to our plant-based diet. There is occasional meat or fish, usually no more than 5 times per month. Beans and legumes are the core protein sources, also providing fiber and promoting heart health. Whole grains and nuts are also staples of the diet, and it is limited on dairy and sugar. So most blue zones avoid or limit cow's milk using alternatives like goat's milk. And one thing that you'll notice with all of the diets that we're going to be discussing is that there's minimal added sugar. And so that is a key concept to just about any healthy lifestyles, avoiding sugars. And then also moderate alcohol intake. So certain zones like Sardinia enjoy moderate amounts of red wine. Other zones are a little less on the alcohol. And then they also emphasize portion control and slow eating.
Yeah, very similar to the plant-based diet with a few variations. We've both seen the docuseries on Netflix that speaks to the Blue Zones and the unique traits that are unique characteristics that lie within the Blue Zones. And it even goes beyond the nutrition. It basically boils down to lifestyle characteristics. And so some of the lifestyle habits that exist in the Blue Zones include not only the diet outline that Kristin talked about, but also regular low intensity physical activity, just regular daily movement like walking, gardening, household chores. They have strong social connections. They have communities that have deep social ties and support networks, or they focus on the importance of family. They also are focused on a purposeful living where they have a sense of purpose in common in their community, whether it's through family or hobbies or their faith. And they have a greater tendency to manage their stress through techniques like prayer or napping or wine at 5 o'clock to unwind in a social setting, commonly seen in Italy. And so all of these things contribute to a lifestyle that is more active, is purpose-driven, and reduces stress. And so those are some things that we're going to take a look at today too in the podcast, how we can incorporate that and what nuggets we can steal from these areas in the world that they call the Blue Zones. And we've talked about the benefits of the Blue Zone lifestyle and diet, and that is enhanced longevity, where it will potentially increase your lifespan, and not just your lifespan, but your health span, like how much you're able to do in those later years of life, and reducing the risk of chronic diseases, and has a lower incidence of heart disease due to the large plant forward focus on eating and low sugar intake.
Now, so to add to that a little bit, I think for the people that were interested in the plant-based diet but thought maybe there were some challenges to being completely plant-based, I do think this is a great option for those those individuals where you can do a mostly plant-based diet. There's a little less supplementation needed because you are still getting some meat, maybe a little bit of dairy. So it's a little easier to hit some protein goals. You don't need to supplement with B12 necessarily, and there's maybe a little more flexibility with this diet. And then also we will be doing a whole separate podcast on our recommendations for alcohol. I do think this diet allows for is a focus on red wine and using that in a social setting, stress technique, but there is some flexibility with incorporating wine into a healthy diet.
And we talk all the time about how diet is important and exercise is important, but as part of the weight loss program here and with the people that are in the school community, we also expand that concept into stress reduction and sleep patterns and all of the other things that come into play. And I think the Blue Zone docuseries and the books that correspond to that also take it a step further and talk about social connections and having a purpose-driven life. Like in the Japanese community, they talk a lot about ikigai, which is your purpose. And we did a transformation course where we were talking about another Japanese principle, which is kaizen, where you have small gradual improvements, like 1% improvements every day. And when you extrapolate that and look, like zoom out, go big picture, it amounts to these massive feats of change, but you're only doing one little thing at a time. And so I feel like in some of these communities, they're very much more philosophical, and they kind of dive a little deeper into the components that contribute to mental health and depression. And so how can people that have a busy life, because I feel like in this country we kind of wear busy like a badge of honor, like, oh, I'm so busy, like it's a good thing. How can somebody who has a busy life apply some of the practices that are found in the blue zones, whether it relates to diet or lifestyle? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think one thing, there's a lot of things, but first I would start with prioritizing sleep. Some of these blue zones, they nap, which for most Americans, that's not really a realistic thing. But I do think getting 8 hours of sleep is not only doable, but necessary. And so that is a great thing to start. There's no reason people can't get 8 hours of sleep. And then for the social part, how can you multitask and, get your social connections at the same time? So, for example, this morning, Jacqueline and I, we went for a walk together. So we got our social connection, we were outside, and we got our physical activity at the same time. And Jacqueline talked about canceling her Netflix subscription so she could spend more time at the gym. You have to prioritize things that are a must in your life. So if you're finding that you don't have enough time for community and social activity, you don't have enough time to be outside, you don't have enough time for exercise, look at where you're spending time in your life and what can you cut out. I put limits on my social media spending time. Before I did that, when I looked back at it, I managed to spend an hour and a half on social media every day. And it's kind of insane to think about, how's that even possible? But it is. We're constantly on our phones. We're, always watching TV and things like that. We are talking about encouraging you to watch a documentary on Netflix, but you do have to think about how much time you're spending doing these things. And then I think a lot of this diet is very meal prep friendly, so that's definitely an easy way to stay on track with diet. So those are just a few things that I think would make it easy to incorporate this diet into a busy lifestyle. So you mentioned something about their high-low concept with physical activity. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So every region is different. Like they sort of boiled down the lifestyle components into its basic pieces, but every community lives that out in a different manner. So, for example, in Japan, they spend a lot of time squatting in the run of a day. They don't really use chairs the same way that we use seating in this country. And so they would spend a lot of time doing high-low activity in the sense that they would be seated in a squat on the floor and then standing, and they would go through that range of motion frequently throughout the day, and that's giving them a lot of large muscle group activity. Whereas in other areas like Greece and Italy, those areas would involve things like hillsides and stairs. So they were getting a lot of high-low activity in the form of walking multiple steps to get from one neighborhood to another, or walking up and down hills to get to their grocery store to get their meals. So every community it manifested itself differently, but basically the principle was the same, that they were doing all of this high level versus low level activity throughout the day. And to kind of piggyback on what you were saying earlier about, I remember once somebody saying that they didn't have time in the day, and then their wife challenged them and said, "Give me your phone," and pulled up on the iPhone, it has the screen time tracker. And so showed him the screen time and said, "I just found you 5 hours a day," because they were spending 5 hours a day probably doom scrolling on social media. But yeah, it's all about like just shifting the focus, shifting the priorities. Like I've noticed for myself, I've done that a lot in the sense of I quit a job that was having me work night shift, which was not easy. That was a huge source of income. So that was a major change. And trying to shift my focus from like even just basic things like speaking what your identity is, saying I don't like going to the gym, or I don't like to work out, I'm not a fitness person. And so shifting that mindset, shifting that identity focus to something that's a little more aligned with where I want to be later.
Yeah, so I can really see, personally, doing this journey with you, how that change has really shifted your purpose in life. And definitely, while there are challenges, it's a lot of stress reduction and changing your sleep habits, and your ability to really focus on your personal lifestyle. So, how else would you suggest that people listening could incorporate this into an urban lifestyle, since obviously these areas are, people are walking to grocery stores and down, up and down hills to go to other neighborhoods and friends, and that's not really something that we're probably doing here in Boardman, Ohio.
Yeah, so I think that in the context of going to the grocery store, maybe instead of walking to the local fish market in Sardinia, Italy, you would just park further away from the entrance at the Walmart, or park further away from the entrance at your local Aldi's or whatever grocery store you're shopping at. And if you are, obviously we're not walking up and down hills to go to the neighbor's house, but if you're driving to your friend's house to spend time visiting, maybe use that time together to go for a walk or to go for a bike ride or something like that that involves physical activity instead of, just driving over to one another's house and then sitting and chatting. Or if you are like living in an apartment building or you work in an office building, maybe take the stairs. And of course, you're not going to maybe take the stairs every day, but some days take the stairs. And if you're instead of taking the elevator, or if you're living in an apartment building, on the days that you go grocery shopping, take the elevator. Or if you're carrying a lot of things, take the elevator. But of those days that you're not, try to incorporate the stairs. A lot of parks actually have steps too. So if you're going to a park, maybe try to work in the steps as part of your visit to the park. So I feel like there are ways that we can adapt it to more of an American environment versus the rural Japan, rural Greece and Italy concept. And I think that there's lots of opportunity to incorporate other habits and lifestyle changes. Maybe what do you do, Kristin, as far as is there a habit that you've observed from the Blue Zone lifestyle that you would like to incorporate or that you think our listeners could easily incorporate?
The best thing out of this diet is definitely the low sugar. And I think that that's something that everybody can incorporate no matter what type of lifestyle and diet they're doing. Start looking at, what your nutrition labels and looking at the added sugar content. The daily recommendation is 50 grams per day. I generally think that is way too high. That definitely should be the maximum that you're consuming a day. I personally try to, my goal is always 0, and I think by having a goal of 0, then when I hit 5 or 10, then I'm still happy with that. But if my goal is 50 grams, then I feel like that always ends up being in excess. So I think that would be a great place for most people to start. And then looking at some of the other things that you would like to start adding in, like adding more legumes to your diet, I think is a great thing for anybody. So you don't necessarily have to focus on what you're cutting out, but adding something like that in is going to naturally increase your fiber and protein intake. They're low fat foods. There's no cholesterol in any of those foods. So that's a great category to try to add, incorporating more of those in.
And I think one of the concepts that we try to impress on anyone that's part of the weight loss community in our school community is to really avoid sugary beverages, because people do not keep track of how much they're drinking in their beverages, whether it's like coffee. I'm totally guilty of this because I used to have a Starbucks and Dunkin' addiction, and I would order coffee drinks all the time that were, I say coffee, but it was like a hot milkshake, basically. It was like so much sugar in there. And so I think that that's an easy way to reduce the amount of sugar that people are taking in, is to cut out the pop, cut out the bubble teas and all the iced lattes and all the stuff that is like packed with sugar. I think that's a good place to start for a lot of people to limit their sugar intake. So thank you guys for listening. That wraps up today's podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. And if you did, please share it with a friend. And we'll see you next time where we talk about another diet that could help you in achieving a longer, healthier life and assist with a weight loss journey. Have a great day.